Police.
I'm Senior Officer Matt Lewis from Customs and Immigration.
Thank you, welcome. I'm going to give Deputy Sutherland's apologies. He said he's unable to attend today. He's normally with us. Thank you. Could I ask, just before we start then, again, thank you for coming in. Could I just ask for an introduction from your officers, Minister, just so I get a bit of a handle on what the specific areas are that you're in charge of, especially in relation to what we're looking at?
Sure. So I run a small team within the Joint Financial Crimes Unit on behalf of Customs and Immigration, and we specifically look at the process of confiscation of assets and funds from a predicate offence, a predicate drugs offence. And the other thing that we look at is cross-border cash and forfeiture under our civil route for forfeiting cash deemed illegitimate at the ports.
Can I just ask what you mean by predicate offence?
So, for example, if there's a predicate drugs offence, my section will look at obtaining how that person has criminally benefited from that criminal activity, and we will also identify what realisable funds they have, and we will submit reports to the court to recommend confiscation of their realisable asset.
Yeah. And the predicate offence, is that an offence that's part of a wider offence? What's the
Yeah, so specifically for us, it's a drugs offence.
Right.
So if it's a drugs offence has been committed, a confiscation hearing will happen, right, as a matter of fact, after that event at sentencing normally for the criminal predicate drugs offence.
So in terms of the cash that might be involved in any drugs offence, importation, for example, of illegal drugs, is the cash usually visible and seen at the same time as the interception, or is it something that might follow later?
It's usually something that follows later. There is sometimes cash involved with the predicate drugs offence that we will hold as an exhibit in that case. But usually what will happen is we will then financially investigate that person and identify through bank transactions and any criminal benefit and also what's realisable at the time and recommend that for confiscation.
Okay, thank you for that. We may come back to that for some more detail. And yourself, Detective Inspector?
So my name's Aidan Kenno. So prior to last week, when I moved to a new team, I was the Detective Inspector in charge of the Joint Financial Crime Unit, which Matt's team sits within. So I was responsible for leading any investigations into serious and complex financial crimes, including fraud, money laundering, some of the more complex false accounting, larceny offences. So we are the main investigative unit that looks at domestic offending in the financial crime arena in Jersey, and I held that role for about 3.5 years.
Yeah, thank you. So we know that as part of our review, we've obviously heard from a lot of people. There's a lot of submissions which value cash, so people seem to still value cash, but we also know that cash is on the decline. The number of transactions that happens in routine purchases or for goods or services often is moving towards card or other contactless payments. In terms of what you see in your areas, which is often to do with illegal activity, have there been any changes in behaviour from criminals in terms of how they pay for things? Is cash still a staple? Is it on the decline as well?
I would say it's always going to be attractive to the criminal element because of the fact it's anonymous. Having said that, we haven't seen any real changes in the amount of cash that we're encountering, for example, leaving the island, which is something that we'll frequently have a look at through way of cash outbound exercises. And we'll conduct those, and we will deem whether or not we consider that cash to be legitimate or illegitimate. In the latter, we will seize it and look to secure it under a cash detention order. And we haven't really seen any change either way. Looking at the limited statistics I've got for the last few years, it tends to be on a level and we haven't really seen an increase or a decrease either way.
Anything to add?
No, I think, thinking about this beforehand, criminals generally commit crime to make money. So that money doesn't necessarily have to be cash. It can be anything, digital transactions, value in terms of gold, assets. So the criminal entity, the criminal fraternity will adapt their means in whatever circumstances they're in. You will rarely get a criminal who only takes cash or only takes drug commodity or cars or watches or whatever it may be. Large amounts of cash are a red flag to criminality within a certain context, within something that we're looking at. So we may, for example, go and do a drugs warrant, and if we find some drugs, or even if we don't find some drugs, but knowing the intelligence picture we're looking at, if we then find a bag of cash hidden in the loft, then that is going to be something that we would be interested in, and that's something that would be a red flag of criminality to us. Equally, when we then examine any bank accounts or any other portfolios of assets that we see that stand out as being unusual within a context that we're looking at, so we can look at a bank account and see that someone has X amount of money in there, we can also deem that to be suspicious. So the presence of cash alone isn't a red flag. It's all about the context, the amount, what you'd expect to find. But we do know that economies or markets such as drugs are a cash-based economy largely. However, we do see a lot of people paying for drugs now on things like Revolut and other contactless payments. I'm not saying Revolut is a particularly problematic platform, but it is easy for people to send each other money in other ways than passing over a £10 note in a pub because, someone's bought a round of drinks. It's, not that £10 will get you much in a pub these days.
Can I just follow up on that? So in terms of how people use cash, would you look at the cash flow as to where it's come from, where it's going, or do you just take it that there is cash that's available in the island and, that's a state, as it were, that you're dealing with in relation to a crime or a charge that you would put around someone? But do you get into following and tracking how that cash actually arrives in the island?
In terms of the individual cases, we don't sort of track cash flow. We don't look at cash flow data or anything like that. Obviously, cash is readily available. Its usage amongst certain demographics and probably a large proportion of people has declined since things like COVID, I think. This is just me anecdotally talking about what we see. Lots of people pay contactless for their everyday, coffee and a sandwich and their parking and their shopping and all that sort of stuff. So we see less cash generally. But in terms of criminal cash, which is what we'd be looking at, and when we seize cash as part of an investigation or we look at finances as part of an investigation, the onus is on us to show that we believe that cash, that money in a bank account, that house, that car is criminal property. And that's what the money laundering offence relates to, is criminal property. So cash can be present, it equally cannot be present. It can be a red flag, equally cannot be a red flag.
Thank you.
And obviously when we investigate, we ask people about where that might have come from. We ask them to provide proof. We might speak to their banks. We might speak to jewellers, estate agents, whatever's relevant at the time.
And so you said you don't monitor cash. So you wouldn't be. Is there any way that you might be made aware of, say, significant events that took place in terms of new cash coming to the island? If, for example, there was a swarm, if we can call it that, of a certain type of British currency that looked unusual, or if there were people paying in lots of money into bank accounts, would the banks potentially contact you?
Yeah,
to flag
potentially.
things up?
So there are mechanisms, and not so much in terms of the sort of different currencies, but we will on an individual basis. So there will be an onus on financial institutions to submit a SAR, which is a suspicious activity report, to the Financial Intelligence Unit. So we would expect if somebody came up to a bank out of the blue and said, I've got £50,000 in cash I'd like to pay in, please, we would expect them to think, well, this doesn't quite sit right, this is not normal. And if they became suspicious that that cash was criminal, then they should submit a SAR, which would then inform the FIU, which is the Financial Intelligence Unit, which would then could inform us. And we have had examples with cases that have been prosecuted and convicted in court where that has happened, where someone has come to the island with an amount of cash, they've tried to pay it into an account, they've tried to buy cars with cash. Those institutions have reported it to the FIU, who have told us and customs colleagues, we've taken action, we've arrested, we've investigated, and we've prosecuted, and the courts have convicted based on that.
And just anecdotally, if somebody is generally turning up to buy a large item like a car with cash, does that, in your experience, normally indicate that there's something else amiss?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. I mean, for example, that case that was heard in court, I think they went, the people involved in that trying to get rid of what was in this case criminal cash by buying high value goods, including cars. I think off the top of my head, something around 12 to 15 different car dealerships, and all of the car dealerships refused, and all of them were very suspicious about that, because not many people buy cars in cash.
No, okay. Thank you for that. Any questions on?
No, that's fine.
Yeah, just in relation to digital payments, are you finding that credit lenders are informing you of most cases, or is it potentially individuals who happen to be aware of transactions that are illegal that are happening, who then report it into your unit?
So the Financial Crime Unit gets a lot of their intelligence from the FIU, the Financial Intelligence Unit, based on the reports that are given to them by industry.
Yeah.
So whether that's banking institutions, trust service providers, lenders, high value. There's no difference in terms of what we do or our response if the suspicion is there that criminal property, criminal money, criminal cash is the poor use in this context, but criminal money has been used.
Yeah.
Doesn't make any difference whether it's cash or we don't have any thresholds on. We won't look at anything to do, above or below certain levels. It's all, if we suspect it's criminal, we'll open investigation. That's what you get.
And from a police perspective, would you say it's a lot more difficult to identify those who are responsible for crime, who use cash rather than, say, digital transactions that take place in the island?
Yeah, it can be.
Yeah.
For the the reason that I could pass Matt a bag of £200,000, and unless anyone's seen us or caught us in the act, then that transaction is gone. If I wanted to digitally pass Matt £200,000, it would be more difficult, and there would be a trace of it there.
Trace of it as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm also guessing that from a policing point of view, that if you have a bag of cash, you know that there's something wrong. Someone may not wish to claim that bag of cash, of course, because it might incriminate them. Whereas if you have money in an account, it's obvious whose account it's in. Then it's a case of proving whether the money is legitimate or not. Is that fair?
Yes.
Yeah. In terms, so I mean, one of the things we're trying to get at with this review, I think, and having you here, which is useful maybe to get to this point, is we're also trying to formulate what the benefits and disadvantages are from a wider social point of view about the journey that's going on towards a cashless society, and that there are those who would wish us or government to make an intervention to stop society becoming either increasingly cashless or completely cashless. We've also had people suggest that from a government point of view, it would be a lot easier if cash no longer existed. Do you think, in terms of that last point, is that something that you could speak to? It may be slightly hypothetical, but what would the implications be for your respective departments and for your wider portfolio, Minister, if we were tomorrow to find ourselves in a cashless society?
Well, I think from a customs point of view, it would automatically remove one of our major considerations, which is cash leaving the island through our ports. But at the same time, I think one of the major implications would be that as Aidan's alluded to already, the criminality wouldn't stop. It would then need to move somewhere else. And one of the obvious places for that to move would be in a baseless online entity, cryptocurrency being a prime candidate. And the implications for that would be that we would then need to be able to trace those transactions, because everything does leave that digital footprint. But going through something like a cryptocurrency would be very much more difficult than we're experiencing at the moment. And I think we would need to have the ability and the infrastructure around it to be able to then follow the funds in that direction, as opposed to following it through cash.
And I was just going to ask, sorry to hold that thought, but are you finding already that there's a move to cryptocurrency within the criminal
Yes.
area? Yeah.
Yeah. We've certainly seen it's playing more of a part in many more of the investigations that we're conducting at the moment. We have the ability to see a limited amount through cryptocurrency, but the cryptocurrency world in its own right is expanding and getting a lot more complicated and a lot bigger. And so that will only exacerbate what we have to put in order to trace those transactions.
It was a very similar question. I mean, are there any particular areas of society where that is more, where that's proliferating more than in other parts of society, shall we say?
I think it'd be difficult to say, because we're only looking at one particular area of society when it comes to our asset tracing or asset management, or on the confiscation side of the crime. We're only looking at a very small spectrum of society, I suppose. But we are seeing an increase in use of cryptocurrency, and I think what we're certainly experiencing is that people who were dabbling before are now starting to get more and more advanced. The knowledge base is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's, I think, becoming more prevalent that we will see a move that way, because it's as anonymous as you can be at the moment with a digital transaction. So if cash were to disappear tomorrow, I think we would see an increase in that type of transaction. And we would, the implications would be that we would have to be able to trace those, and that would involve quite an input into IT-based.
Have you any sort of examples or experience where people will flip between using crypto and using cash? I mean, in terms of their agile way of managing their criminality, if I could put it that way. Do you see that going on?
Not really. I think at the moment what we're seeing is still sits with things like Revolut and the sort of challenger bank world, where it's not a high street bank. But we are starting to see a move out of there, perhaps into more asset-based transaction. An example would be, instead of transferring Jersey money out of Jersey, you could use the Jersey money locally to buy a Rolex watch, and then you could go across to the UK and sell that Rolex watch. We're starting to see a little bit more of that happening because of the risk involved in actually having a large amount of cash on you, and understanding through various cases that we've managed to prosecute, it sends quite a ripple out into the world of people that like to deal in cash through criminality. And so we are actually starting to see a slight move towards more asset-based transaction, and slightly more in the sort of crypto world, but that is still a bit embryonic at the moment.
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask, you mentioned about money leaving the island. So do you tend to see more money leaving the island than coming in at customs, or is there a balance, would you say?
I'm not aware of I know that Jersey notes, is specifically Jersey money. I know it's repatriated to the island. I couldn't tell you, I'm not aware of how much is coming back into the island, so I wouldn't be able to speak to...
But in terms of a criminal transaction, presumably there's more demand for drugs, for example, coming into the island, which then need to be paid for.
Yeah.
So the trick is for the criminal, if someone successfully, from their point of view, brings in drugs and sells them, they've still got to get the money out.
That's it, exactly.
And leave themselves.
And That's it.
Yeah.
So, and that becomes increasingly difficult, especially when we're dealing with Jersey currency.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask as well is about the use of foreign currency as well, because obviously that would potentially draw suspicions. Again, if it was maybe say to be done electronically, banks would often have their foreign central reserves or foreign currency. But when it's done in cash, does that usually draw suspicion for officers?
It would depend very much on the context of the investigation,
Yeah.
to be honest. I wouldn't know. The short answer is not necessarily.
No. Okay, thank you.
It is, and have you got anything to add on?
I think when you talk about cash or electronic, and I think it's already been sort of alluded to a little bit. I think from the actual sort of investigative side and the actual being able to put cases together and get them to prosecution, IT and things that are electronic can make that a lot more time-consuming and obviously a lot more expensive, because you're moving into, and it's the same as, you know, if you think of what was, say, 20, 30 years ago, what you'd go to court with before you had mobile phones, for example, you now have to have an ability to be able to take information off the phones. You'd have to have an ability to take information off all of those new technologies, if you like, which will make it probably a lot more expensive to get a case to court and will make it a lot more complicated. That's what I would identify from, you know, from my knowledge of this. And as I said, what is clearly happening with just generic everyday cases, whether, you know, it's a sexual offence or road traffic collision, serious road traffic collision, all of that data that we've now got on phones is now essential to be provided. And of course, you then have to have the staff and the resource to be able to take that information off those devices. So that obviously makes it a lot more complicated. It's the same as, you know, if you've got cryptocurrency is going to be a lot more difficult to find than somebody with a bag of cash. So I think all of those sorts of things will make it a lot harder, I would say, and a lot more costly to be able to get cases to court. It's not saying that we won't, but obviously that will all have to be taken into consideration depending how things sort of pan out in the future.
Sorry, just to add to what Mary was saying there, I think there's also a consideration for the jurisdictional divides as well. So the sort of legal framework to obtain what is private data from individuals across jurisdictional divides is also a concern that would also be having to be taken into account.
And do criminals know that? They know which countries are maybe better to operate from than others? Or?
No, I don't think so. I haven't seen that. No. We haven't seen that as a pattern emerging. There isn't anywhere where it's conducted to shadow our investigation. No.
Okay. This is probably a slightly different area, but in terms of fraud that can happen, so we hear about online fraud, for example. We know about theft of money can occur as well, of course, but an area of concern, I think, is fraud in different varieties. And is there an issue about, say, the where money is transferred in good faith, but ultimately when you may be able to trace it to a certain extent, but when you get to a bank account at the other end, that bank account might no longer be in existence, or it's difficult to trace? Is that something that you have?
Yeah, so that's something that we commonly encounter. So a large amount of fraud these days is perpetrated by organised crime groups who are based anywhere in the world, and as we've seen in the media, we've heard a lot about fairly recently certainly in the last year or two, unfortunately a lot of people in Jersey have become victims to online fraud, and our investigations will usually take us to a bank account, which then leads on to another 10 bank accounts, which then lead on to another 10, and it's nigh on impossible. Because of the ways that the organised crime groups work, where they will go to a place with people and set up as many bank accounts as they can within a very short amount of time, and then they will move on and do the same, and there's somebody managing the bank account transactions. So where the money goes from the victim's account into the suspect's account, it rarely, if ever, sits there. We then see it move on and on and on, and then may get converted to crypto, or then may go overseas. So it's really, really difficult to trace, to try and get to the person at the other end, or the people at the other end. And especially with the advent of online challenger banks, where you can go on and take a photo on your mobile phone and take a quick snap of a fake driving license, and then you've got an online account, and then you can transact amongst multiple different ones of those accounts.
Well, obviously, the advancement of technology could potentially be quite helpful to all law enforcement agencies globally. And has there been any discussion here in Jersey about the adoption of technology to assist you to look for those criminals who are obviously taking funds from people who are potentially vulnerable as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of technology that we do use to trace or to assist us in identifying bank accounts and flows of funds within individual cases. And there's a lot of technology being used by the institutions themselves to collect the client due diligence and all these things that you need to set up a bank account. But again, globally, fraud is a global crime type. As much as technology advances to prevent criminals doing their work, technology also advances on the criminal side to get around that. So it's very, very easy to open up a bank account nowadays, and you could you could open up 2 or 3 within 10 minutes on your phone, and then we'd instantly be able to send money to each other and transact and buy crypto on different platforms, and it's a massive world.
And with fake ID, presumably, you could, in some cases.
But we also find fake IDs, stolen IDs being used, people being, so we've seen a trend within the island as well of money mules. So people are paid a fee. I will contacted online. I'll pay you 50 quid. I'm going to send you 500 quid, and then you can send it on, please, to this person. No questions asked. Yeah, fine. People don't realise what they're doing. They're complicit in money laundering for who knows what. But that's a growing trend across the world. But we do see it in Jersey as well, because young people typically, get contacted and they don't see any problem with doing something, a quick job for 2 minutes, and they've got £50 or £100, whatever it is.
Can I just ask you about how checks play into that scenario at all? I mean, do you see any sort of activity around checks being sort of exchanged for significant amounts of value? Does that raise any red flags with you at all, or is it really about the cash supply and the card transactions or the bank transactions?
I would say the latter, definitely. It's pretty much all about the transactions and the use of the cash in that particular context. No, checks don't form. I mean, there would always be a consideration if the investigation was pointed that way,
Sure.
but on the whole, no.
Okay. The only time that we see checks really is where you might have a case where somebody has access to a company or entity's finances, and they end up writing checks to themselves, or for their own gains, and basically stealing companies' money by using checks like that.
Yeah.
And then false invoicing or whatever it may be.
Okay, but that's a different way in which you would pick that up for.
Yeah.
I've got a question about the threshold that's used usually around high-value dealer transactions. So we've got a figure of 12,500, I think. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So so the JFSC issue guidelines in respect of becoming a high-value dealer. So I don't know, if somebody who sells whatever, could be antiques or paintings.
It was almost down to the entities or the providers. It was almost down to the entities or the providers' cash policy, if you like. I think the norm is around about the £5,000 mark, was my understanding.
So that may be an upper threshold for certain types. Okay. And
just to comment on that, if I can, just as an example, when we investigated the case I've already spoken about, where the group came over and tried to buy cars, they also tried to buy various different things on the high street, and we did find a lot of the high street, Jersey businesses that they went to, or all of them, were very reluctant to take much cash at all. And a lot of them, like Matt said, it was kind of company policy that they wouldn't take anything over 5,000, for example. So 12,500 to me feels very high. I can't imagine there's many jewellers on the high street who have stood there and taken 12.5 or £12,499 in cash for an item or items. I think that's very high. Feels, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Do you get any intelligence as to when that does happen?
We do. So either through the FIU or, certainly if we're talking about the High Street in St Helier, we've got the community policing team who are very good at forming relationships, maintaining those relationships with different businesses. We do have a number of shops and outlets on the high street or in town where you can go in and spend a lot of money if you choose to. It would be unusual for them to take cash. We have seen them being quite self-protective as a sort of business community in raising it up to each other that this is happening, because again, it's all in the context. If something doesn't look right and doesn't feel right, and there's somebody trying to spend £6,000 in a clothes shop in cash, it just doesn't feel right, then they are very good at raising it up to the police. And we have had instances where we've been immediately alerted, and the case we were talking about earlier is we were able to deploy almost instantly to go and find these people and arrest them, and they've been convicted. But we are quite in touch. I'd like to think as the police and customs, we are quite in touch with the retail and business communities that we do hear about that, because I think it is becoming more unusual, certainly for high values in cash.
Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, what I think we'll do, if you're happy to, and at any point we can come back to anything that's perhaps more directly relevant to where your officers work. We'd like to ask you a few more slightly generalised questions about our review. So in a moment I'll pass over to Deputy Wilson. But I suppose one of the overarching questions that we've touched on already is that we are seeing society organically move to an increasingly cashless society insofar as there are fewer cash transactions, more contactless, as I've said. From a government's point of view, as a government minister, is this something that has been considered up until now about whether government needs to intervene in any way in the use of cash, in the decline of cash? Or
from my perspective, I don't think we've anything's been done or put forward that we should interfere whether people do or don't use cash. From my perspective, I think it's important to realise that there are people within the community that won't have bank accounts or don't have access to credit cards, because still not everybody has credit cards, not everybody is online. So this is based on my own perception and my own sort of feelings about it, is that I would like to see that people can still continue to use cash for what I think is reasonable types of service. It would be, I think, for me, a difficult thing to do to say to a business, you can't take cash or you must take cash, because I think then you're actually involving yourself in somebody's business, which from my perspective I wouldn't necessarily be comfortable with. But I think it is important that people have that opportunity, and I think certainly if they're facilities owned by the government, as what this sort of partially started with, the sports centres and people being able to pay in cash. And I think the thing is that it is about sort of reality and, depending on the type of service that you've got, as to whether, there's somebody at the reception desk, for example, there's somebody actually, a resource that's able to take the cash and all those things. And if there isn't, what can you actually do so that somebody can still pay with cash, the machine or whatever it is? Look at our car parks, for example. It used to always be coins. It's now, You can now pay credit card. You know, you can do it on your phone. But then, of course, you have gotten into a phone. I think you can still buy some of the cards. So there's lots of different ways that people can pay. So for me, I think it's important that we need to make sure that we're still an inclusive society, and so that we're not cutting people out of being able to use cash. But certainly since COVID, I think it was significant that a lot of smaller businesses have said, we don't want cash anymore.
Yeah.
But it's not, I don't think it would be right as a government for us to say to a business, you have to take cash because I've got a choice.
Yeah.
And so as long as, you know, everybody doesn't stop taking cash, then I think you'd always have businesses that will take small amounts of cash.
Can I start? So, you know, the discrimination legislation, does that fall under your portfolio, or is it social? So I think the protected characteristics.
Okay.
Putting you on the spot there.
Yeah, to be honest, I mean,
in a sense, it doesn't matter because I suppose what I'm asking is about social inclusion and.
yeah, I think depending on what you're talking about, some of it will fall. Some legislation will fall under me, and when you talk about the characteristics like the hate crime, things like that will fall under me. But the other sides of it will fall under social security, and the sort of equality and diversity which sat underneath, which was sitting underneath Home Affairs previously, now sits with the Assistant Minister, the inclusion, the Diversity Forum rather.
So I suppose to take one of your last points is that there's been a suggestion that we could be sleepwalking, certainly in some industries, to a point where actually no one will take cash anymore. So one argument's been made, for example, that if you want to buy a coffee and coffee shop X doesn't take cash anymore, you can go to coffee shop Y. But it becomes a problem when none of the coffee shops take cash anymore, and some people are therefore excluded from certain goods and services which they would ordinarily expect to enjoy it. And at that point, the argument's been made it's too late for government to intervene because the change has already happened. So we're hearing a lot. I'm not saying it's cognitive dissonance, but what I am saying is that the argument to say give everyone a choice is only valid insofar as everyone does have a choice.
Yeah.
Can you see a legitimate balance for government to intervene in any circumstance to secure the right of the minority?
I think it might be difficult though, mightn't it be, from the point of view that if you were going to do that, then are you going to provide something for that business to be able to do that? Because as an example, if a business hasn't got the necessary money, float or whatever in their business to be able to take cash. So I think it's probably more complicated than just saying, for me just to say here and say, I think we should intervene, because actually how would you intervene and what are you going to do to intervene? And of course, alongside taking cash or not taking cash, of course, is that in large quantities, in particular, if you were doing it in a store, for example, you've got all of the security that goes with that. And how's the business going to be able to, because of course there's different financial constraints on a business taking in cash into the bank as opposed to having credit cards. So it's actually, when you sit down and look at it, it's actually quite complicated, because of course you pay for a credit card to be used, and I've been into a small shop in the market who wouldn't take a credit card for less than a certain amount, which I don't normally like to do, but it was the day I was caught out with no cash. So they would take not a credit card, but they would take a debit card. And so it is actually quite what I would say is a difficult type of scenario to decide how you would intervene, if I'm honest. But I would, whether I'm a minister or not a minister, just even a member of the community as a whole, I would not ever like to see us have a part of our community that was excluded. So it would be one of those sorts of things as how would we actually do that? Yeah. How would you actually intervene to prevent that from happening? Because I don't think it's very straightforward, if I'm perfectly honest.
No, thank you. That's very candid and I think thoughtful of you. Any questions arising? I've got some others, but otherwise.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what's interesting to explore, given your particular portfolio, is if we are going to move to a cashless society, and the indications are that cash is becoming less used in the island, what kind of issues that might present for you in terms of civil liberties and public safety?
That's quite difficult, isn't it? Because I suppose what you can say is that if you don't have cash, then you can't pay for a cab in cash. So is that talking about public safety? That's a question, isn't it? And so I think the thing is that you wouldn't want to see that. But of course, then the argument would be, potentially, is the safety of that person who's the driver of that cab. So I could say as a cab driver, I don't want to take cash because I'm vulnerable to potentially being a target for taking my cash. So I think the question you asked...
I've not met a taxi driver who doesn't want cash so far.
No,
I might be
but
wrong.
I'm just giving as an example, and I think the question you ask is so generic and so broad, I don't actually think that there is an answer to it, because, you know, everybody has a right to use cash, but I also have... Civil liberties is both ways. So if I run a cafe and I say I don't want any cash, then that's my right to do that. But you, on the other side, might say, well, I want to pay cash. And
it's about proportionality, I think.
It is, absolutely.
So I know this isn't discrimination per se, but you could argue it's about balance of harm. So does it harm, who's harmed the most by not accessing services or by...
Yeah.
So we do say to businesses, you must serve, and you can't discriminate on grounds of sex, sexual orientation, race, etc.
So what you're asking me really is, would I think that we should legislate, which would be under probably, I don't know if it would be under Social Security or under myself, would you legislate to say that people can't discriminate against people using cash?
I mean,
it'd be an interesting thing to do.
I think the balance we've got is that there is a small minority who can't use any other form of payment other than cash. There's probably a wider group who want to use cash but probably could use other forms, so it's convenience.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's about how they're harmed versus the inconvenience on businesses. And arguably, it is an imposition on businesses.
Yeah.
But you could argue it's an inconvenience rather than a harm. So it just might mean you have to have a cash box.
But it's interesting as well, isn't it? Because as well, as we move forward in the years, as somebody that never had a credit card until I was well into my 20s, now young people, as probably young as 12 or 14, have got some type of card, probably younger maybe. So I just wonder, as society moves forward, as the generations change and people's use of technology changes, whether you'll actually end up in the scenario where people actually do use cash. Do you know what I mean? So it is one of those. I mean, from my perspective, I would never want to see that we'd excluded anybody, because I am quite candid in that. But I think for me, it's also very difficult to see how you would have to legislate, and then how you're going to enforce that legislation to say to somebody, well, you've got to provide this or you've got to provide that. What would we be providing to actually alleviate potentially the people saying, well, I can't do that because of this? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
do you think that then, given that kind of scenario and the longitudinal element of it, that there are any short, medium or longer term actions that need to be considered around
potentially that could be the case.
What do you think they may be?
I think it's a sort of a hypothetical scenario, really, because how many people actually have only access to cash? I don't know whether your panel has actually worked that one out, or whether there's any actual data to say how many people in the island don't have a bank account. How many people in the island they might not have a bank account. Do they have a post office account? You know, so I think the thing is that without doing that sort of groundwork to actually find out how many people actually have no access to anything other than cash, because of course, how many people now are paid just in cash? And we were having this conversation this morning. How many people are still paid only in cash? How many people are now paying? Because certainly quite a few years ago, it was, there was a move to get everybody, particularly within the civil service, for example, or manual workers within the states. Yeah. We got rid of all of the sort of ability for people to be able to be paid in cash. So they were paid into bank accounts. So people automatically had bank accounts. So I suppose really the question is as well, you can pay for, if you've got a bank account, you don't need a credit card, you can pay with a debit card. So the piece of work I would want to see, but I don't know if it's possible, if I'm perfectly honest, is actually how many of the community is just got cash and access to nothing else?
Yeah, thanks for that. We do have some. I'm just mindful of time as well, Minister, and there is one thing that I'd like to ask as well whilst your two officers are here. And thank you, because it's been a bit of a hybrid session in the sense that we want to get the maximum value out of the Minister and all of you. Are there any points which you could maybe tell the panel in terms of things that government could be doing in order to minimise the risk of things like money laundering in society? So, for example, if there were fewer shops which were actually taking cash routinely, does that have an impact on the ability of criminals to launder money, for example? Or are there just general things that we should be mindful of in terms of that, the whole sphere of criminality and the...
Yes, with the point you just raised there is if you stymie the ability for criminals to use cash as much as they potentially could at the moment, for example, if you drop that level for accepting cash at high value outlets, then yes, what that would then do from our point of view would move from what we're looking at in the investigation into a transactional, time-stamped, traceable movement of funds rather than an anonymous movement of cash. So yes.
Yeah. Okay. And are there any questions from this side?
Yes, I've just got a question for yourself, Aidan, and it's just in regard, for instance, if we've got a child and say if the parents have maybe set up a bank account, potentially they could be depositing funds into that account, and I just wanted to know whether there is any consideration around that particular area, because that could potentially be a way where electronic payments are still taking place, but again, it's potentially circumventing the police maybe, obviously being aware of that information because they've done it in quite a sophisticated way.
So what we see a lot of different layering processes within the money laundering process. So what as part of the investigation, what we often see is we might see cash being paid into a bank account.
Yeah.
And then we investigate that bank account, and then we see transactions from that bank account to another bank account, or transactions from another bank account into that bank account.
Okay.
And then we, to coin a phrase, we follow the money, and we would then have grounds to look at other bank accounts. Obviously, if we thought that there was suspicious behaviour or criminal property within those bank accounts, and then that's where we might see payments out to challenger bank accounts, where we might see a Revolut or a Starling or a Monzo account used, and then we would apply to that institution to say who owns that account, can we have their setup documentation, and there's a picture of me in my bedroom where I set up the account, taking a selfie on my phone. We then might see transactions going into crypto, we then might see money getting paid into a child's account, for example, or purchases of a car from somewhere, or a house from somewhere. And I think what I would say, just, I have a feeling we're moving towards the end as well, is that cash, I think we typically see cash on a global scale would be towards the lower end of criminality, where we're talking about sort of global transnational organised crime in sorts of criminality around terrorist financing or large movements of value. You're not going to see that so much in cash. I think Matt would agree. When we see, which is an eye-watering amount of money, where we see hundreds of thousands of pounds in cash, that's a high level of criminality. But really, in the grand scheme of criminality, it's not a particularly high. So we are talking
Just on that then, what is your view as to, where a legislative framework can either be introduced or strengthened to actually mitigate or avoid those sort of potential scenarios happening?
I mean, legislating against things like that is going to be very difficult, in my humble opinion. It's putting levels and values on thresholds is very tricky. It's very difficult. Because there will be people who want to buy a car with cash, and that doesn't mean they're a criminal.
No, that's right. I was asking the question.
Yeah, it's very, very tricky, and I don't think I could answer too much more. But building on Matt's point, if there is a threshold that you quoted from the JFSC around high value dealers, but actually we've seen the high value dealers and the businesses themselves say, we think this is a bit high, so our company policy is much, much lower for whatever those reasons are.
Okay. Thank you. So it's more about a self-regulatory approach to it.
And in Jersey, certainly, my experience is that businesses know what's right and wrong, and they don't want criminal cash. And if somebody is there trying to buy high value goods in cash and it just doesn't feel right, 9 times out of 10 in my experience, they will tell us, they will deny the transaction, and they will report to us straight away, which then leads on to an investigation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your time today. And if you've got any other points that we haven't covered, we'd be very pleased to hear from you if you've got anything to submit in written form. Have you got anything to add for us before we bring it to a close? No. So, Minister and officers of